Hello, everyone. Bring up here. And welcome to the webcast. My name is Christine Dorsey Davis. I'm the Executive Director of the Ohio chapter of the American Planning Association, and I am your webcast moderator. Today is Friday, May 31st, and we will hear Planning, Preservation, and Change, the Federal Perspective. For any technical questions related to the presentation, you can just type those in the Q&A box and I'll do my best to answer those. And if you have any questions for today's panelists, again, just type those in the Q&A box and we'll get to those at two different points throughout the presentation today. So just type your questions in as you think of them and we will do our best to get through them. Today, we are hosted by the Urban Design and Preservation Division. Thanks, as always, for joining us each year and providing so many great sessions for us. Coming up on your screen is a list of some of our upcoming sessions. We have a full slate for the summer. Very exciting. So head over to ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast to register for these and all of our upcoming sessions. Today's session has been approved for 1.5 CM credits. So head over to planning.org, log into your My APA account, and from there you can search by today's title or event number, both of which again can be found on our website, ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast, and a PSA for those that are AICP or FAICP that today is the last day of the extension for the 22-23 reporting period. So you need to get all your credits logged into the system by the end of today. If you're on social media, be sure to like us on Facebook. That's where I post any important date or time changes or when new sessions are available for you to register for. And head over to YouTube and type in Planning Webcast, and we'll pop up along with our well over 450 session recordings, all available for free. And be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel so then you get notified when a new session has been uploaded for you to view. So that's it for my housekeeping items. Again, if you have a question, type it in the Q&A box and we're going to kind of divvy them up throughout the presentation. I'm going to turn it over to Marcel, who is going to give some introductions here and kick things off.
Well, thank you so much, Christine, and welcome everyone and happy National Preservation Month. I'm Marcel Acosta, the chair of the APA Urban Design and Preservation Division. I'm also the executive director of the National Capital Planning Commission in Washington, D.C. We're marking the end of National Preservation Month with a special webcast featuring today's speaker, Sara Bronin, the Senate-confirmed chair of the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation. I'm also pleased to announce that the American Planning Association is updating its historic and cultural resources policy through a partnership with the Urban Design and Preservation Division and the Legislative Policy Committee. The APA's historical preservation advocacy policies haven't been revised since 1997, 27 years ago. The policy update offers a significant opportunity to help all planners navigate the complex intersection of planning, preservation, and change. Connecting preservation opportunities to broader planning concerns can help us advocate more effectively at all levels of leadership. So we encourage your participation and input. We've also partnered with the National Trust for Historic Preservation and the National Alliance of Preservation Commissions. The updated policies will be brought to the APA Board of Directors for their approval. So to kick off this initiative, we've asked today's guest, Sara Bronin, to help us unpack the current federal perspective on the intersection of planning, preservation, and change. Planners are very familiar with the impact and influence of the National Historic Preservation Act in our day-to-day work. And we're also stewards of historic and cultural resources in our respective communities. As planners, we're often asked to balance our obligations to protect our historic resources with the community's critical priorities and planning issues, such as the impact of climate change or the need to provide more housing for our residents. Chair Bronin's talk should inspire us and help planners consider ways to connect preservation with broader planning issues. She's really no stranger to the planning community and the APA, given her leadership role in creating the National Zoning Atlas and as chair of Hartford, Connecticut's Planning and Zoning Commission. And as you review her bio, you'll find that Sara's an experienced attorney, architect, planner, preservation advocate, and scholar. And I really can't think of a better person to provide a valuable insight into the federal perspective on planning, preservation, and change. So please join me in welcoming Sara Bronin.
Thank you so much, Marcel, and thank you, Christine, for once again including me in an Ohio APA event. Probably one of those 450 presentations buried in there somewhere is one of the very first conversations that I had about the National Zoning Atlas. So happy to be back here with you all. Let me just expand my screen. So as Christine noted, what I'm going to do is try to actually break up this presentation into two parts. The first part is going to be for those who are not familiar with the ACHP, to talk about it as an agency, and then also to talk about 4 policy statements that we have adopted in the last year, or so just over the year, last 14 months. The reason I want to start with this is because the background of our agency and the policies, I think, can really help the audience to understand where we are, I guess, philosophically right now as the Federal Historic Preservation Agency. And then part 2 will move into implementation. How are we implementing these policies moving forward? So first, really briefly, what is the ACHP, or Advisory Council on Historic Preservation? We have 24 members. That's the most important thing to know, probably, is that we are a council. We have 24 members. We have 9 federal agencies and the architect of the Capitol. We have 8 presidential appointees, most of which have are now from this administration. When I started, most of them were from the prior administration, so they rotate on 4-year terms. I serve at the pleasure of the president as the only full-time member. We have 3 elected officials: a governor, a tribal leader, and a mayor. The current tribal member is Chairman Reno Keone Franklin. And we have 3 organizations, nonprofit organizations, that play a central role in the National Historic Preservation Framework, one of whom was just referred to by Marcel, the National Trust for Historic Preservation, which was chartered by Congress, interestingly, and is written into the statute of the ACHP as being one of our statutory members. The other is the National Conference of State Historic Preservation Officers. So every state and 9 territories and other instrumentalities of the U.S. government have state historic preservation officers, 59 in total. So NCSHPO, as it's called, represents all of those on our council. And that reflects, I think, a special relationship between the federal government and these state historic preservation officers, which are part of the National Historic Preservation Act, and which have special roles in our regulatory process I'll talk about in a moment. And then finally, the National Association of Tribal Historic Preservation Officers, which was not always a member of the ACHP, but as it has built up its membership, as tribal historic preservation officers have increased in number, it was recognized that there are over 200 tribal historic preservation officers across the country needed a voice on the ACHP, because the TIPOs and the SHPOs, as they're called, again, each have a statutory role in the Federal Historic Preservation Framework. So that's who makes up the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation. I wanted to just say a little bit about my role. So I lead the agency as the full-time head of it. The thing that I'm supposed to do, whether in a setting like this or in a meeting with other agencies or the White House, or even with Congress, is to try to represent the stated views of the council. And then finally, to really ensure that we are fulfilling all of our statutory obligations, which go beyond just our regulatory framework and include policy. I also feel like, my role should be to develop a direction for the council. So as Marcel and Christine noted, I mean, my background is in planning and preservation and architecture and urban design. So my bias was already pro preservation, pro cities, pro housing, pro environmental strategies to deal with climate change. And I brought all of those values with me in my role and how I lead the council and try to develop its direction. You'll hear all of those topics being discussed today. So about the advisory council, the main thing that we do, and by the main thing, I mean just by the sheer number of man hours that are devoted to this task, is that we oversee a regulatory process known as Section 106. And it was set forth in the National Historic Preservation Act in the late 1960s and gave us the ability or responsibility to oversee the process by which federal agencies conduct undertakings. And that really runs the gamut from things the federal government actually does or builds to things that the federal government finances or permits to things that generally the federal government assists with. All of these activities with a federal nexus are what we call undertakings, and I'll talk more about that next. But the vast majority of our staff is devoted to the administration of the Section 106 process. The second thing we're supposed to do, in very general terms, is to advise the President and Congress, as well as state and local governments, on historic preservation policy. So we've done this in the past. We've often written letters to Congress on specific legislation, and we've helped to generate big ideas about preservation, including influencing the Preserve America executive order that helped to, for the first time, embed preservation activities coming directly from the president and the White House. But we haven't necessarily fulfilled that responsibility to its fullest, in part because I'm only the second full-time chair. And so we didn't really have that kind of full-time person to just be devoted to policy advancement and discussion. So because our staff is so good at Section 106, and there's so many of them devoted to that, I've sort of viewed my role as falling into this second function of helping to beef up our advisory functions and to work with other constituencies, including planners and architects, to make sure that more people were thinking about preservation when they were thinking about a wide variety of strategies that they needed to pursue in their own fields. So with that, the first part of the presentation is going to focus on Section 106 to provide an outline of that, and then policy statements. So the language of Section 106, my background is a law professor, so I always like to look at the language of a bill or piece of legislation. And so here is the key language, and I've underlined a couple of key terms. The language in this National Historic Preservation Act says, the head of any federal agency shall, prior to the approval of an undertaking, and so there's that word undertaking, take into account the effect of the undertaking on any historic property, and I'll tell you what that is, and afford the ACHP a reasonable opportunity to comment with regard to the undertaking. So we've talked a bit about what an undertaking is. For the purposes of Section 106 review, a historic property is any property on or eligible for the National Register of Historic Places. So as I said, undertakings are those actions that are directly done or undertaken by a federal agency, or that are funded, licensed, permitted, or otherwise approved by an agency. The responsibility of Section 106 lies with agencies. And actually, if I go back to the language, this doesn't say that preservation always has to win. It doesn't say that every building has to be preserved. It only requires a federal agency to take into account the effects of their actions on historic properties. So in the way that that process is laid out for a federal agency is, first they say, okay, what are we doing? What is the undertaking? They define the undertaking, and then they ask, does it have the potential to affect historic properties? The second step is to identify whether there are any historic properties in that area of potential effects. So if they're doing something in the middle of a well-known historic district, then they know what the historic properties are generally. They might do a little extra review, but if it's listed on the National Register, they know what it is. There are other situations, especially large-scale infrastructure projects that are outside of cities, where they do not know what historic properties are affected, where they might have to do archaeological surveys or work with tribal governments to try to identify resources of cultural or religious significance to the tribe. Once they've identified the historic properties at issue, then they have to assess the nature of the effects and assess whether those effects are adverse. And then finally, if they do identify adverse effects, they have to figure out whether they can resolve those effects pursuant to a memorandum of understanding, memorandum of agreement, or perhaps with some advice from the advisory council. Now, on the left here, you see consultation across the whole process. The Section 106 review process requires consultation with tribal governments and Native Hawaiian organizations. It requires engagement with certified local governments. So some of you on this call might be part of a certified local government, which means that you have special abilities to engage. And it also has to include consultation with parties that have an interest. So that could be a local preservation commission, it could be a local historic society, it could be indigenous peoples who raise their hands and may or may not be part of a federally recognized tribe, and more. So these are the consulting parties, some of which I've mentioned: tribes, Native Hawaiian organizations, the SHPOs and TIPOs. Where there are national historic landmarks, the National Park Service comes in as a consulting party. And there is always a lead federal agency or a single federal agency, but several federal agencies might be involved in the same undertaking. So Section 106 is essentially a planning process. It can be used to advance planning goals. It requires the incorporation of a wide variety of perspectives. And in the end, in that fourth stage of the Section 106 process, the resolution of effects, it could lead to mitigation. So the reduction or even minimization or elimination of adverse effects to historic properties. So that's a bit about the regulatory process, and that's going to come up again in the second part of my presentation. But for now, I wanted to talk about the policy statements that we've adopted in the last 14 months. And all of these are really significant to the work of the Advisory Council. And the first two are maybe the two that I really pushed to get over the finish line. The second two on burial sites, human remains, and funerary objects, as well as indigenous knowledge, had started before my time. And I can tell you that I've learned quite a bit in going through the consultation for these policy statements. Before I get to the specific policy statements, I do just want to mention how we adopt policy statements. So it's the full 24-member council that votes on them. They do pertain, as you can see here, climate change, housing, and so on, to a particular topic. And what we do is we develop a draft, we circulate it to the public, we do tribal and Native Hawaiian consultation, we take those comments, we hear from our members, and we revise the policy statements in response. These are typically 10 to 15-page documents. They don't have a lot of programmatic detail, but they generally tend to contain either factual or aspirational statements about how we as a federal agency, with all of our members and all of those views represented, should move forward in thinking about historic preservation policy. So in a lot of ways, I think the deliberative and open public process that's used to develop these policy statements has been a pretty good gauge for taking the temperature of the preservation movement nationally and the ways that the preservation movement is developing and moving forward and embedding their ideas into federal policy. So starting with the climate change and historic preservation policy statement, I want to pause for a second on the policy principles that we've embedded in the statement. So there are 15 in this one. And again, they range from about 10 to 15 different principles, each having a paragraph or two explaining them. In the climate change policy statement, we talk about gathering information, about incorporating indigenous knowledge, a term I'll talk more about in a moment, in encouraging government entities to plan for climate change, to prepare for disasters, and to facilitate mitigation, especially mitigation as it relates to buildings and energy efficiency. We talk in the policy statement about expediting clean energy and clean climate-friendly transportation projects. That means a lot of types of modes of transportation, not including the private vehicle. Equity consultation, bedrocks of our Section 106 process are also discussed. And then most of our policy statements talk about training, education, and collaboration. Number 10, flexible guidance is something that we will talk about in part 2 as well. But I wanted to just pull out for the planning community that's on this call and planning adjacent folks that the key principles for you might be the need for data and the need for an understanding of where our historic properties are, because without knowing that, we can't plan for them to be protected. The need for a central government response. Climate change is bigger than local governments. It requires a much bigger response, and we have been working in a lot of different ways to call for a federal response to this, including calling for a climate heritage office to be developed at the ACHP. The last point, that policy statement called for more flexible federal preservation standards. Now, this is something that the federal preservation standards are developed and administered by, oddly enough, an agency that's not ACHP. They're embedded in the National Park Service in a small unit there that develops these standards. And in the policy statement on climate change, we recognize that while progress has been made on those federal preservation standards, called the Secretary of the Interior Standards for the Treatment of Historic Properties, there's a lot more that needs to be done in order to update them to meet modern challenges. Challenges like the need to relocate buildings, which is currently discouraged, the need to address flooding, which has been partially addressed by some guidance that's been issued, the need to respect the fact that in some cases we may want buildings to remain in place or sites to remain in place and intentionally release them. In other words, not save them. The possibility that we might need to deconstruct some of our structures and buildings, and to acknowledge that where that is required and where there is no other choice, we need to have clear protocols as preservationists as to what to do. So again, there's a lot of climate dimensions of the standards that can be discussed, and happy to talk about those. The second policy statement on housing and historic preservation is really, we had one in 2007, but if you're a preservationist, you might sometimes feel under siege by the language that's out there by people who are not necessarily sure about preservation's role in housing development. As a preservationist, I see preservation as being one of the key, not the enemy of evolution, but in fact, one of the key generators of housing, including affordable housing, for the duration of preservation's existence. If you look at the housing policy statement, it reflects a member-wide, 24 council members voted on this, a member-wide perspective that shares mine, which is that with the right tools, existing buildings can be converted to housing and have been converted to housing. And existing regulatory tools should, in a sense, get out of the way for housing conversions and rehabilitation. The first thing we talk about in the housing policy statement is the historic tax credit program and the way that that has been influential in helping housing creation and the need to continue to beef that up. Strategies on weatherization, zoning strategies. And these, again, while I'm very interested in zoning through the National Zoning Atlas and a forthcoming book on zoning, this came from a lot of members as well as the public, that preservationists promote higher density, promote mixed uses, and promote conversions, especially in those areas where zoning has restricted development to single uses. Building codes and ADA compliance. We talked in the housing policy statement about the fact that energy codes are not necessarily updated for historic preservation in that they exempt historic buildings. Maybe we shouldn't do that anymore. Maybe we should enable historic buildings to come up to energy codes. With ADA compliance, there are always design solutions, or almost always design solutions that can help improve compliance. And we need to be more proactive about developing those solutions. We have a couple things. Another comment in this, another section deals with those federal historic preservation standards. That's part 7. We call for new guidance in section 106 for housing projects. And again, we call for more research, education, collaboration, and partnerships. So again, key principles maybe for this group, the zoning provision, and the fact that here we have a body, a federal agency that's talked about zoning as being a key local strategy to implement these broader federal goals, ADA compliance and accessibility, and promoting that efficient planning, permitting, and section 106 reviews is really an essential part of this. Now, the last 2 policy statements have primarily related to tribal and indigenous people's issues, but not entirely. So for the burial grounds policy statement, which was adopted in March 2023, very shortly after I arrived, again, and I can take very little credit for this other than in trying to carry it forward to the best of my ability. We had to put in this policy statement things that should be a matter of course for anybody who's working on a project that could disturb burial sites. And the first and foremost one is respect for these sites, making disturbance a last resort, consulting with descendant communities, again, embedding that idea of indigenous knowledge into our understanding of the importance of these sites, recognizing that there have been significant federal agency disturbances of and disrespect of these sites, including tribal burial grounds, but also burial grounds associated with, I would say, less enfranchised people, communities with environmental justice concerns, disadvantaged communities, and so on. We talk about the need to prepare these sites for climate change. We just at the ACHP visited the female union band Mount Zion Cemetery in Georgetown as part of a business meeting, which is a historically Black cemetery and significantly impaired by climate change and erosion, and also impacted in some ways by federal agency projects happening in Rock Creek and around. So we talked about that with the stewards of the site, and there are probably burial grounds in your communities that have these issues as well. For this group, again, just pulling out some key principles: respect remains indigenous knowledge and descendant communities. Recognize there was a big series this week on the federal Indian boarding schools, and there are burial sites on those federal sites. And the treatment of those children during their lives and in death is wrong. And our statement recognizes that, but that is, I think, a really important thing for us all to be aware of. And so if you haven't read those stories this week or don't have the background on that, please do so. And then finally, planning for the impacts of climate change. This is our most recently adopted policy statement, again, setting out these broad principles on, in this case, indigenous knowledge. So indigenous knowledge is not to be defined by the federal government, but can be described as a set of observations, beliefs, customs that are attributed to indigenous peoples and that draw from their relationship to the environment and their understanding of the world around, so the broader cosmos, maybe. We have not in federal government processes, including Section 106, or in federal government decision-making, truly incorporated indigenous knowledge into our policy principles. So what we say is that when we talk about Section 106 and talk about special expertise, that includes indigenous knowledge. We say that it's valid and self-supporting, meaning that somebody who holds indigenous knowledge doesn't need to prove to us that they hold that knowledge through some kind of documentation or dissertation. They can tell us what they know, and we have to accept it as federal decision makers. There's a deference to tribes and Native Hawaiian organizations embedded in this Indigenous knowledge policy statement. Just as was the case in the burial policy statement, number 9, addressing compensation, that just like we pay archaeologists and surveyors for their work, we should pay in Section 106 processes, federal agencies should pay holders of Indigenous knowledge for sharing that knowledge and expertise. It's an equivalent service that is provided to the federal government. And then thinking about Indigenous knowledge, the qualifications that do you need a PhD to show you have Indigenous knowledge? Well, in our policy statement, we say, again, no, you don't need that kind of expert qualification. Those expert qualifications are also, from a formal perspective, administered by the National Park Service. And we're hoping that with this policy statement, we can continue to help evolve those to include holders of Indigenous knowledge. So again, key principles: Indigenous knowledge is valid and self-supporting. It must be recognized through the Section 106 process, and tribes should be compensated for their expertise. I do want to say all of this is a mouthful. So as I close this first part of my presentation, and I'll open for questions and as soon as I'm done with this slide, so feel free to chime in the Q&A. All of these are written up in brief in Planning Magazine this month. So again, 4 federal policy statements, different order there: housing, climate change, burial grounds, and Indigenous knowledge. But check out Planning Magazine, and this is a freely available online link. Maybe Christine or I can put it in the chat. But I'm going to stop there and pause for questions on the ACHP and the policy statements. And then next I want to get into how we're implementing them. So I'm going to stop sharing for a moment.
Great. And I will put a link to that report in the chat box. It looks like we only have one question right now, which is very typical, I guess, of our group. The questions seem to come in towards the end, but we'll take care of this one. Oh, here they come. The Tribal Historic Preservation officers, do they communicate with one another on proposed federal projects?
Yes. So the National Association of Tribal Historic Preservation Officers maintains a pretty robust forum for TIPO. I'll just, rather than say the long version, is TIPOs, to communicate. I know they have regular board meetings. They have their annual meeting. They have there was a meeting just for California TIPOs last month that I was able to beam into. So they definitely have that kind of conversation going. Even TIPOs that aren't members of NAFPO, as it's called, communicate, especially when there are issues where multiple tribes have an interest in the same area. So we do see 106 cases where multiple tribes, again, will have the same interest in a particular federal undertaking. And if those tribes have TIPOs, the TIPOs will communicate. If they don't, the leaders will communicate, or some combination. So yes, my understanding is yes, that is definitely the case.
Okay, thank you. You just mentioned the 106. Could you clarify the role of the general public in Section 106 reviews?
So the general public does have a role. They can intervene as a consulting party. So we do have several ongoing higher profile 106 projects, including one in Chicago that's ongoing, where individuals have raised their hand and asked to become consulting parties. There is a process for the public to weigh in. I would not say, though, that with 120,000 undertakings happening every year, that there are, certainly we don't coordinate those that public outreach. As the federal agencies that do that, unless we're doing something specific. But we, I guess I would just say, there is a role, and sometimes it's more active than others, and it's somewhat self-selecting in terms of when the public participates.
Okay. This is a good one. This is a good question. It says, I don't understand the relationship between climate change and historic preservation. Can you link the two for us?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's two dimensions. So one, and you can think about this maybe, so in the National Register, there are lots of different types of resources that are listed. So there are buildings, structures, sites, which are often archaeological sites, objects, which might be a shipwreck, and districts, which are collections of any of the preceding four. I just encourage you for that question to think about just the buildings dimension. Others have different aspects, but if you just think about buildings, the reuse of a building is an environmental act because of all of the embodied carbon and energy that's in a building. So in a way, preservation itself is a sustainable action because we are reusing something we've already invested in. But going beyond that, buildings that, and I think in some cases, the conflicts come in what preservationists have set forth as the design standards for rehabilitations. So you have to have a certain kind of window. You can't put an energy efficient window in. You can't put certain types of insulation in. You can't put renewable energy on a building. That's not always the case, but in those situations where we haven't found a design compromise that allows for our buildings to be more energy efficient or to be powered by renewable energy, we see that there's a conflict in preservation policy between the overall goals of reusing buildings, making them more comfortable for occupants, making them cheaper to operate, and meeting environmental goals at the same time. So that's one dimension, is that mitigation dimension. The other important thing on again, let's just use buildings as the main way that this comes up, is adaptation. So I was just in Charleston a couple months ago with the Preservation Society. I was in Portsmouth, New Hampshire at the History Above Water Conference. I was out in Honolulu this last month looking at epic rainstorms that flooded all of downtown. We are seeing and I visited Lahaina in Maui, which was subject of wildfires that have a climate change focus, and of course suffered a devastating loss of life, as well as the destruction of historic Lahaina. If you look across so many communities across the country, our historic buildings are at risk of the effects of climate change. And sometimes preservation policy hasn't caught up to those risks and doesn't set out really clear ways for property owners to address those risks through changes to their buildings, through changes to landscape, creating fire breaks, for example, raising buildings from flooding, or even allowing for different materials to be used that might be, for example, better at withstanding increased precipitation. So preservationists on the ground recognize these realities. I can tell you from going to all the cities that I just mentioned, they all know this is coming and they know that we need to urgently change, but the federal government hasn't yet caught up to those demands. And so part of what we're trying to do with the climate statement is to say buildings should be adapted to save them or protect them or treat them differently in the face of climate change. And buildings should be a climate solution, in that they should be able to have these upgrades done to them that would meet our environmental goals while still being a pro-preservation outcome, because the reuse of the building itself is pro-preservation. So again, maybe a long-winded answer, but there's a lot of dimensions to that. And let me just give you a quick overview.
I want to dig into one piece of this. So there's a lot of sea level rise in a lot of coastal communities, or, whatever kind of body of water that you're on. Do you see any new policies regarding climate change assistance in like relocating or raising, I guess, historic structures, but essentially taking into account structures that are along bodies of water that are experiencing a lot of sea level rise?
Yeah, I mean, I think for relocation, we've seen some federal support for relocation, particularly to Alaska Native communities, and it's the Isle St. John in Louisiana. So we have seen some federally involved or supported relocations. I think we're going to have to see more of those at scale. And when it comes to relocating entire communities, there's so many different things that come into play, you know, beyond just the historic buildings themselves. But if you think about what makes a community, a lot of times it is the places where communities gather. And so as we're thinking about relocation, again, from a planning strategy perspective, that local involvement, sort of identifying what's important, using historic properties as just one dimension of that is going to be important going forward. But what we shouldn't do is just say, well, if it's relocated, it loses its integrity because it's no longer in the location. I don't think that we can make a good case for that in all cases as preservationists anymore. And we need to be more proactive about stating in what circumstances can we abandon this notion of integrity of location, so that people can still get the incentives, that the tax credit incentives and these other incentives that come with historic designation, and then not lose those simply because they were forced to relocate a building because of climate change.
Thank you. And you tell me when you want to stop. I'm not sure how much more time you have doing presentation things, but I've got a whole host of questions. So I'll at least ask one more, and then maybe we can move on and then get back to some of these and some new ones at the conclusion. And this is more of like a broad question. So how are the federal policies implemented? Are they passed down to state preservation offices? Local municipal governments, can they seek assistance directly from a CHP in terms of like revising comp plans or just any kind of assistance? Or is there sort of like a hierarchy to look at?
Yes, that's a great question. I'm noticing I can't post anything in the chat. So to answer this question, I'm actually going to put a link in the Q&A, which so I think hopefully people will be able to see that, which links to the Advisory Council State and Local Government Advising page. So this is something that, as I said, we are already being more active on, and that website lays out under what circumstances will we advise on state and local government questions exactly like yours. We've just gotten a request from the City of New York Planning Division. And by the way, I'll be in New York on June 20th if anybody's there for a Housing and Historic Preservation Roundtable. We just started publicizing that today. But we've been asked to opine on the new zoning efforts there. We have been asked by preservationists in Florida and Connecticut to weigh in on recently proposed state legislation. Florida unfortunately passed that legislation we advised against, which puts coastal historic heritage at risk. The Connecticut legislature did not pass the legislation we advised against. But we have now criteria and protocols by which we will advise state and local governments. And that's especially important to me, given my background in state issues, but also in local governments and local planning and zoning issues. So it's, if helpful, and if we are asked, and if it meets our criteria, we are happy to weigh in. So I do think, though, the first part of that question, which is how does the ACHP advise on implement its policies, is exactly what I was going to talk about next. And you'll see I didn't even have to change my slides here. And that is the title of part 2. So I'm going to keep going with that, and maybe in a much more long-winded way than you anticipated, answer that question. So I wanted to talk about 4 aspects of implementing these policies. So as the federal agency, we oversee the way other federal agencies will undertake Section 106 reviews. I'll talk about that one last. I do want to just talk about the push for more flexible federal standards, the ways that we inform state and local decision-making, which I just addressed, and raising awareness of these issues. So as you heard I'll just skip to this, in the climate policy statement, we had language in there, one of the principles that said the federal government should expand and more flexibly apply its guidance on the treatment of historic properties threatened by climate change, It should accelerate the development of additional guidance for treatments of historic buildings and sites facing climate risks. And it should incorporate technological innovations and material treatments and increase the flexibility in retrofitting buildings to be more resilient. In the housing policy statement, that parallel language said the federal government should expand upon its guidance for housing. We need to incentivize housing development, particularly affordable housing, and facilitate adapting non-residential buildings to housing. This is word for word quotes from our policy statement. So taking those quotes as my marching orders, in July of 2023, is that right? Yes, July of 2023, I issued a call for public comments on the Secretary's standards. I incorporated those comments into a 600-page report. It's available at achp.gov/standards report. I encourage you to read every word, or at least the first 2 pages of the executive summary. And I want to point out, this is a building that I think a lot about when I think about the Secretary's standards. It was an industrial building that had a nonprofit was developing for office space and a public library. And I want you to look carefully and see what you notice about this building and what looks weird about it. And since there's not a lot of I can't dialogue into the chat or see your chats, I hope you notice that all these people are wearing jackets. And the reason they're wearing jackets is because for tax credit purposes, it was said that they couldn't have insulation on this building because the historic nature of it was such that you had to keep in frozen Connecticut, where I did most of my work, insulation off of these factory walls. I mean, okay, what happened because of that? To get the tax credits, they didn't do the insulation. The building is more expensive to heat. The occupants in it are wearing jackets, and that is not great, especially when this building is located in one of the highest poverty census tracts in the country. So when we, as preservationists, kind of strictly think about standards that are developed in Washington, D.C., we don't necessarily always think about the consequences on the ground. I think this picture tells us exactly what those consequences are. So here's the cover page of this very serious report. In the report, 300 plus pages of it are other people's comments. So those are the public comments that we got. We encouraged the Secretary of the Interior and ACHP to issue guidance on housing conversions, including changes to interior circulation of buildings, subdividing large assembly spaces, adding new additions to historic buildings or campuses, solar energy, and energy efficient features. We also encouraged the expansion of, I should say, this was my report to the members, expansion of training, the facilitation of precedential interpretations, kind of a niche topic I won't go into. But also we should probably evaluate the structure of preservation governance. Some of the treatments that I think we need to add to the cadre of current treatments include protection. These are all climate related. Stabilization, relocation, intentional release, and deconstruction. I previewed a couple of those. I'm going to skip over some of those, but just to say that there's a lot to do in making our federal historic preservation standards more flexible. And as an implementation action of our policy statements, I've taken that on to try to encourage that. Second thing I'll just mention, so there's that URL again, state_and_local_legislation. We've talked with, again, Charleston, Florida, New York City, we'll be doing New York City, Connecticut, and other places where we provide formal guidance on that. I also feel like raising awareness of our policy statements. We will be supporting the APA's effort to revise the historic preservation policy that it had from a few years ago. I'm so excited that you are doing that, and I'm very happy to help. And so raising awareness of the issues is also something that's really important. Section 106 enhancements, though, is what I wanted to talk most about. We are proposing program alternatives. So program alternative is a way you can think about as fast tracking Section 106 for certain things. We don't do that very often, but I think we need to do some major thinking about program alternatives, and that should say 5 program alternatives, I think. We're still developing them, but that implement some of these policies. So if you look back at the National Historic Preservation Act, you see always there and elsewhere that when people wrote that act, they talked about preservation in service of other goals. So here, so that its vital legacy, the legacy of heritage, has cultural, educational, aesthetic, inspirational, economic, and energy benefits. So it's never preservation isolated on its own. It's preservation in service of all of these other goals, including culture, but also including economic and energy benefits. And I just want to sort of say that when I say preservation isn't the only thing, I'm not saying I'm not a preservationist. I mean, I live in 19th century buildings ever since I left Texas. I love old buildings, and as an architect, I painstakingly restored my own 1865 brownstone in downtown Hartford. But the thing is that a lot of what we need to do as preservationists is also think not just about preservation being locking places in stone, but making them vital for the present and the future. So we've expressed these views too. So in the Indigenous Knowledge and Historic Preservation Policy Statement, we talk about this. In the in the Housing Policy Statement, we talk about Section 106 processes and trying to marry, in this case for housing, the goal of providing housing with, quote, efficient and effective permitting processes and reviews. We talk about participants in 106 approach those reviews flexibly. In the Climate Policy Statement, again, these are word for word, so you get a sense of what these statements look like. We say we want to contribute to decarbonization, improve operational energy efficiency. And in that statement, we also say we want to expedite Section 106 reviews for clean energy projects and, quote, climate-friendly transportation infrastructure projects. At the same time, we see from Congress that there is an increasing desire by Congress to exempt certain types of infrastructure from Section 106. There are right now 15 different legislative exemptions. I'm about to issue letters to various congressional committees advising against exemptions from Congress to 106, because we, as the Advisory Council, have the ability to do these program alternatives to, again, streamline Section 106. So we've called on ourselves as the ACHP to streamline reviews. We've said we need to make it easier to integrate Indigenous knowledge, housing, climate change into Section 106. And it's my thought that we need to develop a clear set of rules that takes a general approach to these issues. And so with that in mind, I've started floating with members and am busily working towards 5 different program alternatives. So one is what we would call an exemption. And if anybody's out there from Hawaii, I'd love to get your feedback on this. It's an exemption for Indigenous knowledge informed activities by Native Hawaiian organizations that are swept into a 106 process. So what we're saying with that proposal, which is just freshly out as of this week on the street, is that we want to exempt those activities from reviews. I also want to do what's called program comments, government-wide program comments on 4 topics: housing, climate-friendly transportation, renewable energy or clean energy, and energy efficiency. So on the Native Hawaiian exemption front, so I'm going to talk about each of these, and then I think I'll wrap up after that. So this Native Hawaiian exemption, so again, it is aimed to be consistent with our Indigenous Knowledge Policy Statement, which said that Indigenous knowledge is valid, independent, self-supporting, it stands alone. So I'm testing our theory here and saying, well, if that's true, then those activities that are led by Native Hawaiian organizations, which is the group that we recognize as representing Native Hawaiian interests, and there's a number of them, but we define Native Hawaiian organizations in our regulations that are informed by Indigenous knowledge and likely to have minimal or non-adverse effects on historic properties, that those should be exempted from Section 106 review. If you go to our website, or if you just Google proposed exemption ACHP Native Hawaiian, you will get to this page. I encourage anybody who has any interest in these issues to please look at this exemption draft. Tell me if the proposal is, tell the ACHP, there's a way to provide comments, if the proposal covers enough, if the activities are appropriate, and if you think that there's anything to add. So this is active. I'm hoping that we can do a good round of consultation with the Native Hawaiian organizations and engagement with the general public, and that we come back with a complete draft for our members to vote on very soon. We've only done this 4 times in the history of the advisory council, had an exemption. So this would be very unique. And it would be the first time that we weren't exempting a process or a technique, like we just exempted electric vehicle charging stations. That was one of the 4, believe it or not. This is something I think much bigger and much more, again, consistent with our Indigenous knowledge statement, but long overdue, in my opinion, from the federal government. And if any of you are in Honolulu, I just published an op-ed about it yesterday in the Honolulu Star Advertiser, so check it out. So turning now to the program comments, housing is a huge need, and we need to make it easier to build housing. That's just a statement of fact. One way to make it easier is to ensure that when we're doing Section 106 reviews, we are putting the effort and review resources into what needs to be done and not putting it into what doesn't need to be reviewed. So what we want to do is to develop a clear set of rules for housing in historic buildings that will help on the ground practitioners understand adverse effects. This is a picture from Hartford, Billings Forge, which is a great housing rehab of it's actually a multi-use as a restaurant, as a bunch of a community center, of a historically manufacturing facility. Second program comment that we are seeking, will be seeking input on, we don't have a draft yet, is the development of a program comment on climate-friendly transportation. So here's another picture from Hartford. Actually didn't get a bus in this one, but it's a bus rapid transit station in the Parkville neighborhood. We want it to focus on walking, biking, and public transportation infrastructure within developed areas. So in urban locations, it's that kind of infrastructure that can help boost historic districts, and that often is not incompatible with it, because when you fix a sidewalk, when you build a bike lane, these things are often economically, environmentally, and spiritually beneficial to these areas. This too is in Hartford. This is my rooftop at that brownstone. This is illustrating the fact that renewable energy and historic properties can go hand in hand. So I want to do a program comment that cuts across federal agencies that can facilitate the installation of solar energy on historic buildings, in urban locations, on landfills, or other areas that do not have tribal interests. I also would like for us to consider some offshore wind related topics, maybe too niche to get into here. Energy efficiency. This is another building, the Colt North Armory from Hartford. And this has been rehabbed, but this is what it looked like before. And I don't think there's any argument that could be made that these windows as they stood were energy efficient. But the developer there had a really hard time getting energy efficient windows into that building because of federal historic preservation standards. So where there's a federal nexus, ACHP should create clear rules as to when energy efficient materials that allow historic buildings to comply with energy codes, building codes, and to be more comfortable for their occupants are allowed. And so that's another thing that's on our agenda and that I think is called for by our policy statement. I want to do these program comments together. By the way, again, the Native Hawaiian Organization exemption is out. Please comment if you have an expertise, or even if you don't. coming away. But the other four, we haven't launched the public engagement yet. So I want to do them together though, because I think that they have reinforcing values behind them. I think that they can help us address those public comments in the Secretary's standards, which focused as on housing, renewable energy, energy efficiency. I want to make sure that we are drafting provisions across the documents that are consistent. So whether they're tribal consultation and compensation provisions, indigenous knowledge provisions, they're all consistent. And then finally, to reduce consultation fatigue, to try to sort of group these together. Oh, actually, finally, to facilitate a clear message to Congress and other public entities, I want to be able to say, hey, look, Congress, you don't need to keep trying to exempt Section 106, exempt federal investments from 106. We're already doing a lot to fast track Section 106 for projects that are meaningful to people and that have these other values. And I don't know that we've ever really communicated that to Congress in a way that is effective, I guess, is evidenced by the fact they keep trying to exempt projects from Section 106. So I'm hoping that just by the sheer scale of projects that could be addressed by the adoption of one or more of these program comments, we'll be able to really make a strong case that we've been doing everything we can to promote the creation of housing, promote environmental goals, promote comfort for people as they occupy their buildings, and promote a more sustainable transportation system. The federal government has a role to play here. And if we just keep things as the status quo, Section 106 will keep running its course, but it will take longer than it needs in many cases. And that's one of the things that I feel like I was put here to do. So moving forward, I actually didn't tell my special assistant, Adam, that he might be getting emails, but I would welcome your input on any of these. And you can email Adam, you can email me. I'm at chair@achp.gov. But if any of these, especially the last four program topics, come to trigger anything in your mind, specific examples that might be good for us to know, specific ideas that you'd want for us to include in the program comments, let us know. And in the meantime, please follow the Advisory Council on social media, because we will be over the summer launching a rapid series of public engagement sessions on these topics and others. As I said, we just posted today about the fact that I'll be convening a roundtable with the State Historic Preservation Office, DCP, the Landmarks Preservation Commission, Open New York, the Furman Center, and the Municipal Art Society in New York City on housing. So we'll have a really great roundtable on June 20th. I'll be in Chicago in July. Floating around the country. I'll be out in San Diego at the Latinos and Heritage Conservation Conference. So wherever you are, chances are I'll be there at some point. I'd love to meet you in person, because doing a webinar is great, but it's much better to meet in person. So thanks, everybody. And now I think we can get back into Q&A.
That sounds good. Great. So let's dive right in. First of all, yes, we are recording this session. And we will have the recording up on our YouTube channel. All right. So, regarding, I don't even know where I want to start. Okay. So for many of us, our direct link to federal historic preservation activity are the historic preservation tax credits. Are there more flexible standards being explored to drive ability for smaller tax credit projects to be funded?
That is a great question. The historic tax credit is the most important tool for preservationists by far, because it closes the gap between, for a financial gap for a project and makes it viable. And there have been hundreds of thousands of housing units created, tens of thousands probably of businesses that have been created. And it's positive because it has these rehabs have significant ripple effects. The question is really about the small projects, which under 5 million, maybe even under 10 million, it's so complicated to do these projects and comply with the historic tax credit standards that oftentimes people who are doing those projects either don't do them or avoid the use of the tax credits just because of all the legal work that goes into it. I wish that I could wave a magic wand and get the Park Service to update its standards for the historic tax credit program. They have a copy of my report, and I don't know that they're super interested in doing that, especially, at this, they have other things on their agenda. My report leans heavily on a write-up by the Historic Tax Credit Coalition, chronicling project after project where the standards were applied, big and small, in ways that deterred investment and will deter future investment by those same developers. So I'm totally with you. I have tried. I haven't gotten any traction. If you have any magic wands to send my way, please do. In the meantime, what I'm doing is developing through our program comments what we're going to have is essentially an appendix that says, here are the rules for Section 106 projects. And what I'm hoping is that the way that I like to do processes is just open it up. Hey, send me an email. Hey, we're going to have public sessions. The more information and the clearer we can make our rules and help people move forward, the better. And so my hope is that if we can do it on the Section 106 side, that will inspire a change in the tax credit administration side. Because I do think that you have raised a very good issue, one that has been raised, again, if you look at that report on the standards, by many others.
Thank you. So this question says, I'd like to hear more about how historic preservation intersects with broader community design. So for example, what are your views on preservation sites that are in conflict with an effort to improve walkability in a neighborhood, or rezoning to a mixed-use district, or new or expanding public transit projects? So how should we approach those conflicts from the seat of the planner?
So I don't think those are conflicts at all. I think all of those things, from my personal perspective, all of those things should be done. Like, that's just what makes a great community, is a walkable one. People, and the proof is in the pudding for that one, as my dad would say, because people pay more to live in areas that are walkable. If you look at the most desirable urban neighborhoods, they're those walkable mixed-use communities. So I think if you want to promote preservation and historic buildings, you will make those areas walkable, make them mixed use, open up different housing possibilities. Lots of historic districts were built with accessory dwelling units, for example. They were built to fluctuate between 1 and 4 units over time as economic conditions changed. They have always been flexible. So I guess I would just say, I don't view those as being in conflict, unless what you're saying is sometimes, there's community hesitation. And I guess reflecting generally on the role of planners, one thing that I've seen in the sort of local dynamic is that often planners who have the greatest expertise are the least able in the local political processes to voice that expertise and translate that into action, just because of the political dynamics. City council or the mayor, and folks are at odds in that sense. So in a lot of ways, some of this goes back to the need to, make planners who are the experts in these topics, and who know, just by their studies, by their data, by their understanding of the way cities grow, that all of the things that you mentioned are important for quality of life. We need to figure out a way for planners to have more power at those local levels.
So this question came in actually towards the beginning of our conversation, but I'd like to ask it and then kind of expand it out. And I did this on our last webinar at the beginning of the month. It was also about kind of the future of preservation, and the conversation came up there too. So the specific question is, are landscapes ever considered historic resources under federal law, or does the scale stop at districts? And I'm going to just add to that. Can you give the elevator speech on what technically is historic preservation? Like, what counts as historic preservation? Is it just buildings? Is it landmarks? Is it, can it be burial sites? Is it landscapes?
Yeah. So
Talk
I
to
gave
us about that.
categories of historic historic properties on the National Register. So building, structures, objects, sites, and districts. So landscapes can be considered sites, for example, cultural landscapes that have, so these can, a landscape cannot be on the National Register unless it has a human dimension. In other words, a scenic area is not something that can be listed unless something happened there, or some human designed it, or there's some sort of cultural or tribal resource there, or significance. So yes, landscapes can be listed, and they are listed, but they have to have that with that dimension. You asked too about grave sites. Interestingly, at least from a federal perspective, grave sites and cemeteries are not always listable on the National Register, unless there's something significant about their design or about the people who are buried there. So when we did this policy statement on burial sites, human remains, and funerary objects, we were careful not to say that this only applied to those sites that were listed on or eligible for the National Register. We wanted to provide a broader statement about those types of sites that would be more applicable in any event, when whether a federal agency, for example, in a 106 case, had done an assessment of the historic value of a set of human remains that it happened to encounter on a project. And by the way, I apologize to anybody on this call for whom this is a difficult topic. But just to say, from a National Register perspective, in many cases, those are discouraged from being listed.
Okay. Next question. This one says specific to the housing policy, and I'd kind of like to dive in a little bit more about housing and as it relates to historic preservation. So folks, if you have specific housing questions, get those in now. So this says specific to the housing policy, should municipalities exclude vacant parcels from local historic districts in order to eliminate any additional constraints, particularly time, costs, that may make creating affordable housing more difficult?
I don't know. I mean, I don't necessarily think it's that there's a need to do that, and unless what you're saying is that you're dealing with a locality with a historic commission that never wants anything to be built on a vacant site within a historic district. I think the better thing to do across the board is for us to develop design standards that would enable infill. Infill is another thing that we've discussed and promoted in the housing and historic preservation policy statement. So whether it's technically in the historic district or not, I think a great thing to do is to develop design standards, and not crazily onerous design standards, but design standards that can be understood by individuals who are going about their lives and trying to build something on their lots. And I think that's probably the best approach.
Thank you. Do you have any thoughts on ways in which zoning can support the nexus between affordable housing and historic preservation? And I guess this is more like even really just taking historic preservation out, your thoughts on ways in which zoning can be updated to make it easier for affordable housing to come into communities. And you just said updating design standards is one way to make it easier or more complementary. So do you have thoughts specifically, putting on your zoning hat, ways in which we can update zoning codes, or even just internal administrative policies to really support and hammer home that we're serious about affordable housing in our community, and we want it to be here?
Yeah, I mean, I think that from the ACHP's perspective, we've put out the ideas that accessory dwelling units, enabling a better mix of unit types, 1 to 4 unit, promoting infill, not, trying to fast track. I know some communities have put out, again, pattern books and form-based codes and things like that, that avoid public review processes. And just tell people what they have to build and let it be a counter permit. In Hartford, where I was the chair for 7 years, we made all housing as of right. So there's no public hearing for any housing. We significantly densified the city. We allowed for accessory dwelling units. We eliminated minimum parking requirements. That's also in the ACHP housing policy statement, by the way. And we rezoned many of the industrial areas, which frankly, Hartford City, founded in the 1630s, is not going to be an industrial capital again in the near future. So it's time to rethink those buildings. In creating the Connecticut Zoning Atlas and looking at the National Zoning Atlas. So if those of you who are on this call haven't heard of those projects, just go to zoningatlas.org and maybe your community is up on the map. If you look at your community, you can see where housing is allowed, 1, 2, 3, and 4 family housing, where you've got minimum parking requirements. It's a pretty cool resource. One thing we haven't put up there yet is historic districts, except when they are separate zoning code layers. So if they're outside of the zoning code, they're not up. But if you look at in the historic districts, there's a whole lot of, especially in New England, of formerly industrial areas that are not zoned for housing that should be. There are, frankly, a lot of downtowns, including small towns, but including larger areas where housing is either not allowed or only allowed on certain streets or only allowed subject to a full special permit public hearing. Those are the kinds of things that don't really like, they were put in the code 50 years ago, but they're not necessarily valid anymore. I mean, there's a huge amount that can be done on zoning and historic preservation. I'm not, you should check out a copy at the library, don't buy it, but I'm publishing a book in October. It's called Key to the City. And it talks about a lot of these strategies, and especially how places like Baltimore, Hartford, certainly, and other sort of post-industrial cities, as well as modern cities, have tried to grapple with these issues. One of my favorite examples is actually Galveston. I'm from Houston, the land of no zoning, but Galveston has used its zoning code, I think pretty typically, but pretty effectively to maintain its historic districts and do it in a way that allows for a few different uses and maintains its very cool charm. So those are some good examples, I think, for the crowd.
Thank you. Next question, and this has come up in some form a couple times now. Is there any consideration for expanding the proposed NHO exemption to Section 106 to all federally recognized tribes?
What we are doing with the NHO exemption is essentially a test case.
Okay.
If you think about NHOs, they are located in one state. They tend to share some common historical site and construction techniques and practices. So what we've listed there includes aquaculture, fish ponds, traditional Native Hawaiian materials, and so on. And what we think about this is that if our council votes on this and moves it forward, and we can see how it works in this limited context, that we could actually expand the types of activities and expand it to the mainland. But right now, because there are no federally recognized tribes in Hawaii, because Native Hawaiian organizations, there's actually a huge amount of activity involving federal agencies in Hawaii. We think it's going to be a good test case, a toe in the water, to try to move that forward. I also, as I mentioned, I visited Hawaii and I saw myself that in Kaneho Bay, in Pearl Harbor, there was fish pond involving the Navy. There have been Department of Interior grants that are happening right now to Native Hawaiian organizations. There's stuff all over the islands and the Lahaina recovery that I think could benefit from this. And so we're seeing it as, let's get this off the ground. Let's show that it works. Let's show that it saves federal agencies money and time, but that it also provides meaningful relief to NHOs, which just haven't had it in the past and have been the subject of, I think, cultural degradation at the hands of government actors. And so this is sort of a small way to address it. Tribes as well. And so I'm hoping that this is a way for us to prove that Indigenous knowledge can be integrated into 106 effectively to the benefit of all the parties. So that's my hope.
On a webinar earlier this month, I was floored by a story of a family who purchased a home. I want to say it was a brownstone. I'm not sure, but regardless, they purchased it. It was in a historic district. And I believe it was that they had a child in a wheelchair, and after they purchased the home, then they wanted to install like a wheelchair lift or a ramp so that their child could get in and out of their home. And the local authority said, nope, that's not part of our historic, our historic makeup, and that would alter the building. And so the answer is no. And it blew my mind. But then it also got me thinking about ADA and accessibility and retrofitting buildings, and making them accessible to all. And in what ways do we need to be thinking about that, as we're looking at these historic structures? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, so I think, almost like, I mean, I never see a conflict. Maybe that's just my way of viewing the world. I don't think there should be a conflict between, in the vast majority of cases, access to buildings, because we're mostly talking about buildings here as a resource type, and historic preservation. You can always find a design solution that works, except, let's say, in the context of a house museum or something where it's 17th, 18th century building. I mean, maybe there's a case to say, okay, well, we really shouldn't, it is, the thing itself is the thing, and we provide different ways of access, which, by the way, is allowed by the ADA. The ADA allows for sites like museums that should be publicly accessible to provide videos or immersive experiences for places that are not accessible within buildings. But I think as preservationists, sometimes we throw up our hands or I mean, actually, I think the thing is there's not enough preservation architects. There's not enough architects and engineers that have that design capability. And so much of what is proposed ends up being really ugly, for lack of a better word. And so probably part of it is on the architectural training grounds out there, including Cornell, where I work normally when I'm not part of this federal agency, to promote that sensitivity and that sort of design aesthetic, rather than promoting this idea of the visionary architect that can build whatever they want. I mean, I guess I would just say a lot of it comes down to a well-trained designer or well-trained preservation professional or architect that can really navigate those issues and come to that design solution. It's not necessarily something that we can legislate in every instance or think about every single material scenario, but I bet we could do a much better job in coming up with pattern books, because if you look at the historic building stock across the country, Christopher Alexander or others' work that is documented the building types that we have across the country, they're not entirely different. We got townhomes, we got brick townhomes, we have triple deckers in New England, we have, and so on and so on. So, you could try to figure out how we should address that. We should be more proactive in that. Federal government probably, our agency probably, well, we are so tiny, we don't have that expertise, but I throw sometimes things out into the world and hope that somebody catches them.
So what would you tell a local community when a planner, let's say, and they're facing their policymakers and their decision makers? What are some of the things that we need to say about the benefits of reusing historic buildings, whether it be in housing development or not, and sort of debunking misperceptions regarding historic preservation as a barrier? What are some of the things that we should say to our policymakers and our decision makers to get the conversation going?
There has been some work done on the environmental benefits of buildings and reusing them. And I used the phrase earlier, embodied energy or embodied carbon, all the work that has gone into buildings that already exist is an environmental investment, and demolishing those buildings is sort of, again, wasteful from a construction waste perspective. We should also, as preservationists, not be afraid to say that many historic buildings are beautiful and add to quality of life. That's not the only reason for preserving a place, but I think when you see a well-preserved and beautiful historic neighborhood with trees and sidewalks and all these great things, you get a sense that this place is special. There's an investment here. It brings value to my world. When you think too about the way historic places developed, main streets in particular were mixed use, walkable areas, which proved that those strategies worked in the past. It was actually in the 1950s and 60s when we changed zoning, or we imposed zoning and then changed it to disallow those kinds of mixed use walkable communities from being created. We did something wrong. We did something bad to our communities. We made it so that we live in these disconnected, car dependent places that actually make us less healthy, less happy, and less able to sustain ourselves as communities going forward. Just because, I mean, if you look right now, the receipts are coming in to communities with lots of roads. So from an infrastructure perspective, the density and the type of communities that you see in historic areas are actually good for a city's bottom line, because if you build a dense mixed use environment where people don't have to rely on cars all the time, what you're doing is you're actually reducing the footprint that the city or the county has to maintain over a 20, 30, 50-year period. And if you look at the backlog of road repairs alone, not to mention other types of utility investments that need to be upgraded and repaired, it's the length. The cost is correlated with length. So getting back to our roots and planning for communities that have a lot in common with the kinds of historic communities we naturally developed pre-zoning, pre-car in the past, is, I think, something to lead with. I do think the beauty should be in there too.
I love that. And you know what? Let's wrap up on that, because the rest of these, there's still a ton of questions. So everyone, like Sarah said, reach out. And as a reminder, we are recording this session. We will post it onto our YouTube channel. Don't forget to log those CM credits if you need them. Thank you, Sarah, for joining us, and best of luck to you. We'll be watching out for that book of yours. Don't forget to look at those links in the chat box that I sent out. There's a couple links in there. And register for our upcoming sessions on ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. And last, thank you, Urban Design and Preservation Division. As always, thanks for putting together these excellent sessions, these important sessions. So thanks, everyone. Have a great weekend, and we'll talk next time. Thank you.
Thank you.